Kalispell, Montana. Winter clung fiercely to the trees, shrouding Emily Harris's world in endless white. The pines behind her grandparents' old farmhouse seemed taller than ever, their needles crusted with snow, their shadows stretching and overlapping until the woods felt more like a storybook maze than real life. Emily was only 8, but she already understood that the woods kept secrets. She'd moved here just before Christmas, after her father, after everything changed. The grown-ups talked quietly about her being withdrawn. She didn't care what they called it. She just needed to escape the weight of silence in the house. That's why, on that cold January afternoon, she wandered past the edge of the tree line, while her grandmother baked pies, and her grandfather tuned the old radio. With each crunching step, she felt herself breathe a little deeper. The air was sharper out here, filled with the scent of frozen pine sap and something wilder. She noticed things others missed, rabbits' prints, crows darting from branch to branch. But today, something strange caught her eye. An uneven track pressed into the snow, half buried by last night's wind. It was too big for a deer, too round for a wolf. Emily crouched, her mitten brushing away a crust of snow, a hoof print. It was almost erased, but the deep, rounded shape was clear. She looked up, heart pounding, following the faint marks as they weaved between the trees. The silence grew thick. The world held its breath. Then she saw it, a shape huddled beneath a low pine. For a moment she thought it was a fallen log, or maybe a brown bear cub curled against the trunk. But as she stepped closer, her eyes widened in disbelief. There, tied loosely to a branch with a torn length of old rope, stood a horse. Or what was left of one. The gelding's fur was dusted with ice, his head drooping almost to his knees. He looked half frozen, silent except for the frosty clouds puffing from his nostrils. His left hind leg quivered, and Emily saw a dark, ugly wound just above his hoof. The sight of him, a living thing abandoned in this wilderness, snapped something inside her. She forgot to be afraid. She took a slow step forward, whispering softly like she remembered her dad doing when they'd watched wild elk from the truck. "Hey there. It's okay. I won't hurt you." The gelding didn't flinch when she reached out and gently touched his tangled mane. His eyes, deep and almost human, met hers for a moment. Emily felt something pass between them, a silent, desperate understanding. Her breath shook as she stroked his neck, feeling the cold and the thrum of life under her palm. "What happened to you?" she murmured, glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to answer. There was only wind, rattling the pine needles. She glanced at his rope. It looked as if it had been hastily knotted, not the way someone who cared would tether a horse. The brown gelding bore no saddle, only an old harness crusted with ice. As she circled him, she noticed a faint mark on his shoulder, almost like a faded brand. "You need a name," Emily whispered, thinking of something strong, something alive. Her dad had always loved trees, especially the tall ones that withstood any storm. "Timber," she decided, brushing a tuft of snow from his ear. "I'll call you Timber." Timber shivered, but didn't turn away. Emily couldn't shake the questions racing through her mind. Where had he come from? Who could leave a horse like this? Alone, injured, waiting for something or someone. 100 stories flickered in her mind. Runaways, bandits, lost pets, heroes riding through the snow. But none of them felt right. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed in the woods. A branch snapping. Emily spun, her heart racing. She thought she saw something move between the trees, a shadow too tall to be an animal. For a split second she held her breath, clutching Timber's harness. The silence settled again, heavier than before. Was someone watching? Or had she imagined it? Emily looked back at Timber. His ears flicked toward the darkness, but he made no move to bolt or neigh. He trusted her, or at least didn't fear her. That was enough. "Let's get you out of here," she whispered, trying to sound braver than she felt. Her boots slid on the icy ground as she tugged the rope, coaxing Timber gently toward the clearing. He limped, favoring his injured leg, but followed her without resistance. Each step away from the woods felt like a victory, a rescue mission unfolding in real time. By the time they reached the edge of the property, the sun had begun to set, turning the snow to gold and the pines to black silhouettes. Emily didn't stop to think about what her grandparents might say. She only knew one thing for sure: she couldn't leave Timber to freeze or starve. Later, when she burst through the back door, cheeks burning, shouting for Grandpa Frank to come quick, she couldn't have guessed how much her world was about to change. She didn't see her mother's look of shock or her grandfather's quick, calculating glance out the window. All she saw was Timber, standing in the fading light, waiting for her. And for the first time since her father disappeared, Emily felt something strange and impossible bubbling up in her chest. Curiosity, yes, but maybe something bigger, something like hope. The news that Emily had brought a strange, injured horse to the edge of their snowy property spread through the house faster than wildfire. Grandpa Frank was the first outside, his long flannel coat thrown over his shoulders, boots crunching loudly through the brittle snow. Emily watched his face as he approached Timber, a mix of concern, calculation, and something softer she couldn't quite name. He stopped a yard away, taking in the animal's shivering body and wounded leg, then looked down at Emily with a question in his eyes. Emily stood her ground, clutching the frayed end of Timber's rope. "He was tied up out there," she said quietly, nodding toward the pines. "He's hurt. I think someone left him." Grandpa Frank bent down, inspecting Timber's leg without touching. He made a low sound in his throat, a habit he had when something worried him. "Old boy's in rough shape," he murmured, then glanced at Emily. "You did the right thing, Em. We can't leave him out here." Inside the house, Emily's mom, Sarah, was less convinced. She rushed to the window, eyes wide, clutching her sweater tight around her. "Emily, what have you done? We can't keep a horse, especially not one that's hurt. What if he's sick or dangerous?" Emily braced herself. "He's not dangerous. He let me touch him, Mom. He's just scared. And cold." But Sarah's voice rose with panic. "We're not equipped for this. What if someone comes looking for him? What if he belongs to—" Grandpa Frank cut her off gently but firmly. "He needs shelter tonight. The storm's rolling in again. We can figure the rest out tomorrow." That settled it, at least for now. While Sarah fretted in the kitchen, Grandpa Frank set to work. He dragged a bale of hay from the old shed, shaking off a dusting of snow, and cleared a spot in the barn's drafty corner. The place hadn't seen much use since their own horse, Molly, passed away years before. Now, the familiar smell of hay and leather mixed with the unfamiliar sense of emergency as they prepared a makeshift stall for Timber. Emily stayed by Timber's side, whispering encouragement and petting his mane, while Grandpa Frank set up a heat lamp and brought out a bucket of warm water. Timber was trembling so hard his sides shivered under Emily's touch, but he made no move to bolt. He hobbled into the barn, following her slow steps, his breath coming in soft, ragged clouds. Emily winced each time his bad leg buckled. Once inside, Timber collapsed gently onto the straw, eyes drooping with exhaustion. Grandpa Frank carefully cleaned the wound, murmuring to the horse in that low, soothing way Emily remembered her dad using. He applied ointment and wrapped the leg with strips of torn sheet, working slowly so as not to startle Timber. "This'll do until we can get Doc Walters out here," he said, more to himself than to Emily. The barn was chilly, but Emily didn't want to leave. She sat on an upturned bucket beside Timber, feeding him pieces of apples she'd snuck from the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, her mind didn't race with the endless questions about her father's disappearance. Instead, she focused on the rhythmic rise and fall of Timber's chest, the softness of his breath, the trust building between them in the flickering light. That night, after dinner, Sarah finally relented. She stood in the doorway of Emily's room, her expression a mix of resignation and worry. "He's your responsibility for now," she said, voice tired. "But if there's any trouble, we'll call animal control." "Understood?" Emily nodded, unable to keep the small smile from her face. "Thank you, Mom." Later, after everyone else had gone to bed, Emily bundled up and slipped out to the barn with a heavy blanket. Timber's ears flicked when he heard her, but he made no sound. She draped the blanket over his back, sitting beside him on the straw. She found herself talking, softly, about anything and everything. How much she missed her old home, her dad's bad jokes, the way winter in Montana felt like a different planet. Timber listened, his eyes half closed, his breath warm on her hand. He didn't speak, but Emily felt less alone in the dark. In the days that followed, Timber became her shadow. As his legs slowly healed, he followed Emily everywhere, limping behind her as she gathered eggs, waiting by the porch while she finished chores, whinnying softly when she disappeared inside. The neighbors, far off down the road, might have called it odd, but to Emily it felt like destiny. Her laughter, long absent since moving to Kalispell, echoed through the barnyard. For the first time in months, she found herself grinning over little things, a robin hopping on the fence, Timber nuzzling her coat pockets for treats, Grandpa Frank's gruff jokes as he fixed the broken latch on the barn door. Sarah watched all this with a worried gaze. She tried to hide her concern, but Emily could see it in the tight line of her mouth, in the way she glanced out the window each time Timber limped past. One afternoon, she pulled Emily aside as she brushed Timber's coat. "Sweetie, I know he means a lot to you, but we still don't know where he came from. Someone might come looking." Emily looked up, determined. "Then we'll tell him the truth, that I found him, that we helped." Sarah sighed, pulling Emily into a quick hug. "You have a big heart. Just don't get too attached. Okay?" But it was already too late for that. Each day, the bond between girl and horse deepened. Timber seemed to sense when Emily was sad, pressing his head against her shoulder until she giggled. He limped a little less, ventured a little farther from the barn each morning. By the end of the week, he was strong enough to follow Emily into the woods, at the property's edge, always watching, always listening. One morning, while Emily sat on the porch steps tying her boots, Timber nudged her arm and gazed at the pines with an intensity that made her shiver. It was as if he remembered something important, something neither of them could put into words. Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, whispering, "We'll figure it out, Timber. I promise." And somewhere, deep in the snowy woods, a new story was waiting to begin. For the first time since moving to Kalispell, the barn felt alive again. Timber, growing stronger each day, became more than just a shadow for Emily. He was a secret companion, a puzzle she couldn't stop trying to solve. Yet the question of his past weighed on her like a riddle carved in the frozen Montana earth. Where had he come from? Why had he been left to freeze among the pines? That question haunted Emily as she fed Timber one morning, stroking the soft fur along his neck. Grandpa Frank came in from the cold, shaking snow from his cap, and handed Emily a battered cardboard box. "Thought you might want these," he said quietly. "Your dad's things, from his ranger days. Your grandma wanted to throw them out, but I figured you'd want to look." Emily hugged the box tight, her heart racing. She hadn't seen much of her father's stuff since they'd packed up their old house in Boise. Here, in Kalispell, his memory seemed to hang in the air, unspoken, heavy. The box was filled with all the odds and ends a forest ranger accumulates: faded maps, a dull compass, broken pencils, a rust-stained canteen, and at the bottom, a battered green notebook. The journal's cover was soft and worn from years of use. Emily flipped through the first few pages, scanning her dad's familiar looping handwriting. Most of the notes were ordinary: weather logs, trail reports, animal sightings. But in the back, tucked between two pages, was a faded sketch done in blue ballpoint pen. Emily's breath caught. The drawing was simple, but unmistakable. A horse, brown with a white star on his forehead and a tiny jagged scar on his left shoulder. Timber. Above the sketch, her dad had written, "Petroleum 5. She frowned. Petroleum 5? Why would her dad give a horse a code name? The next page made her heart race. The final journal entry was brief, hurried, almost like a warning. "If anything happens to me, M5 knows the way. Trust him. Emily ran her fingers across the words, her mind spinning. What did her dad mean? What way? And why did he trust Timber, Patrol, M5 so much? She closed the notebook and hurried out to the barn, Timber's name echoing in her head. Inside, Timber was waiting, nuzzling the stall door. Emily pressed her forehead to his, her thoughts churning. "Did you know my dad?" she whispered. Timber's only reply was a soft snort, as if even he wasn't sure of the answer. That afternoon, while brushing out Timber's mane, Emily noticed something she'd missed before. A small, rusted metal plate hidden beneath the layers of the horse's old harness. She untangled the cracked leather and squinted at the faded engraving, fingers trembling. RPD M5. She nearly dropped the harness. RPD, Ranger Patrol Division, and M5, just like in the journal. Emily's mind buzzed with excitement and fear. Timber wasn't just any horse. He had been her dad's patrol partner. She raced inside, waving the plate in front of Grandpa Frank. "Look! Dad wrote about Timber in his journal. Patrol, M5. In this plate, it matches." Frank took the harness, his weathered hands turning it over slowly. He nodded, lips pursed. "Your father always said that horse was smarter than most people. When he was out in the woods for days at a time, it was M5 that brought him back. Every time." Sarah, overhearing, shook her head, unease in her eyes. "That doesn't make sense. Why would he just show up here? Now?" Emily had no answer. All she could do was show her mother the journal, the sketch, the coded entry. Sarah scanned the words, her mouth tight. "If anything happens to me, M5 knows." She closed the book, eyes glistening. "Your dad always said the forest had its own way of talking to those who listened." That night, sleep didn't come easy. Emily lay in bed, the journal pressed to her chest, replaying the last days before her dad vanished. He'd seemed worried, jumpy, distracted. He'd left for work early, come home late. Emily remembered the way he hugged her extra tight the night before he left for his last patrol. Now, with Timber here, it felt as if the forest was trying to whisper secrets she didn't understand. Unable to rest, Emily crept out to the barn, her flashlight beam flickering over the dark rafters. Timber stood at the far end, shifting uneasily. As Emily approached, he looked at her with wide, alert eyes, then stamped his hoof, once, then twice, as if pointing to something important. Emily knelt by his front leg and traced her hand along the metal plate again. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" The barn door creaked in the wind, the night deep and silent beyond. Emily stared at Timber, 100 questions tumbling through her head. She turned back to the notebook, flipping to the last page. In the margin, her dad had scribbled a map, rough lines tracing the outline of the Harris property, with a small X marked by the northern tree line, right where Emily had found Timber. Why there? Why now? She felt both closer to her father and more lost than ever. But one thing was clear. Timber's appearance was no accident. He was a living clue, a piece of a story only just beginning to unfold. As dawn crept in, coloring the snow in shades of rose and gold, Emily vowed not to stop searching for answers. Her father's message was clear. If anything happened, trust Timber. Whatever secret he'd left behind in the woods, she'd find it. And so, as the sun broke through the pine branches, Emily and Timber stood together in the crisp morning air, bound by hope, determination, and the unspoken promise that neither of them would give up until the truth was found. The days had begun to stretch longer, but the Montana winter still gripped the land with icy fingers. Each night, frost crept across the farmhouse windows, painting swirling patterns on the glass. Inside, the wood stove glowed, and Emily spent her evenings piecing together clues from her father's old notebook, her mind turning over every detail about Timber and the strange coded messages her father had left behind. But the peace that had settled over the Harris home after Timber's arrival began to shift. Emily first noticed it in the way Timber stood at the barn door each evening, staring out into the growing shadows as the sun set behind the pines. Sometimes she'd catch him raising his head suddenly, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring as if he sensed something, someone, moving just beyond the light. One night, after a particularly long day of searching the woods for more signs, Emily, Grandpa Frank, and Timber traipsing up and down the northern ridge, Emily lay awake, long after everyone else had gone to bed. The old farmhouse creaked and settled, and somewhere, far off, a coyote yipped at the moon. Emily's heart wouldn't quiet. She slipped from her warm blankets and tiptoed to the kitchen, peering out the frosty window toward the barn. Timber was not inside. Her chest tightened with sudden worry. She grabbed her coat, pulling on boots too big for her feet, and crept out into the night. The snow was blue and silver under the waxing moon, and the forest pressed close, silent and watchful. Emily made her way across the crunchy yard, her breath sharp in her throat. She found Timber standing just outside the barn, head high, staring straight into the black line of pines. For a long moment, Emily stood beside him, trying to see what he saw. All she heard was the wind and her own heartbeat. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Timber stepped forward and planted himself directly in front of Emily, blocking her view of the woods. He let out a low, rumbling snort, almost like a warning. Emily reached for his mane, whispering, "What is it, boy?" But Timber's gaze never left the darkness. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, a branch breaking underfoot. Emily froze. Her eyes strained against the darkness, searching for movement. That's when she saw it. A figure, half hidden among the trees, a flash of red cloth bright against the shadows. She ducked behind Timber, pressing her cheek against his neck, watching as the man in red moved carefully through the underbrush. He paused, turning his head as if listening. Emily couldn't make out his face, but she saw the glint of something metallic at his side, a flashlight, or maybe a tool. Her mind raced. Who was he? Why was he out here in the dead of night, so close to their home? The man moved deeper into the woods, fading into the darkness. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, knees trembling with fear and adrenaline. Suddenly, Timber snorted again, louder this time, and stomped his hoof. The sound echoed across the yard. The man stopped for just a moment, then vanished, swallowed by the trees. Emily waited in silence, hardly daring to breathe. When she was certain the man was gone, she knelt to inspect the snowy ground where he'd stood. There, a deep, muddy boot print, and beside it, a scrap of red fabric snagged on a low branch. She picked up the fabric, her hands shaking. As she turned to go back inside, Timber nudged her forward, his body warm and solid against the chill. Inside the house, Emily didn't wake her mother or grandfather right away. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, the red scrap clenched in her fist, trying to convince herself she hadn't imagined it all. But the boot print was real. The fear was real. By morning, Emily couldn't keep the secret any longer. She found Grandpa Frank at the barn, repairing a broken hinge. "Someone was out there last night," she whispered, her voice thin. "A man. In a red jacket. He was watching us." Frank straightened, concern etched deep on his weathered face. "You sure, Em?" She handed him the fabric and led him to the boot print, now half filled with new snow. Frank pressed his lips together, brow furrowed. "This isn't good," he muttered. "Not good at all." Sarah was terrified when she heard the news. "We need to call the sheriff," she insisted, clutching Emily close. "What if he comes back?" Frank hesitated, but Emily nodded. He was looking for something. Or someone. By noon, Sheriff Riley had arrived, stomping snow from his boots in the Harris's narrow entryway. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, but his face was serious as Emily recounted her story. He listened closely, jotting notes in his little black book, then walked the property with Frank and Timber. The sheriff examined the boot print, the torn fabric, and the broken branch. "It's not much," he admitted. "But I believe you, Emily. I'll put a patrol on this road tonight, just in case." He paused at the edge of the trees, scanning the endless forest. People sometimes wander in from the highway. "But if you see anything else, anything at all, you call me. Understand?" Emily nodded, clutching Timber's mane for comfort. The sheriff's words should have been reassuring, but that night, as the family gathered for dinner, a heavy tension settled over the house. The world felt smaller, the woods darker. Sarah locked every door and window, Grandpa Frank kept his old hunting rifle by the kitchen table. Timber paced the barn restlessly, nostrils flaring at every sound. Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening for footsteps on the porch, the creak of the barn door, the snap of twigs in the yard. She remembered her father's words. "If anything happens to me, M5 knows the way. Trust him." She pressed her face into her pillow, whispering, "I trust you, Timber. I do." Outside, in the endless dark, Timber stood guard, ears trained on the woods, as if daring the shadows to come closer. Emily knew, deep down, that their quiet life was about to change. And somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting. But so was she. And she was not alone. The threat of the stranger lingered over the Harris family like a storm cloud. Even as daylight painted the woods with gold, Emily felt the unease that clung to her skin. She saw it in the way Grandpa Frank's laughter faded, in Sarah's anxious glances, in Timber's restless pacing by the barn door each night. The snow had begun to melt in patches around the lake, the pines dripping with cold water, the air sharp with the scent of thawing earth. It was during this uneasy thaw that Grandpa Frank decided they needed answers. Real answers, not just memories or ghost stories. It happened one gray afternoon. Frank found Emily in the barn, brushing Timber's coat. The old man's voice was soft but urgent. "I think it's time you saw where your dad used to keep his gear," he said. "Might be something there we missed." Emily nodded, heart fluttering with hope and dread. She'd heard stories of the old ranger warehouse by the lake, a battered cabin where rangers kept tools, records, and sometimes secrets. Now, as Timber limped faithfully behind, she and Frank crunched through the muddy snow, Timber's breath hanging like smoke in the cold air. The warehouse stood on the far side of the property, part wood, part corrugated steel, with the faded ranger emblem still visible above the sagging door. It looked abandoned, but to Emily, it hummed with the energy of things left unsaid. Frank forced the rusty lock with a crowbar, and together they stepped inside, the air thick with dust and memories. Inside, shadows lurked in every corner. Old shelves lined the walls, stacked with cracked radio equipment, dented lanterns, boxes of rain-soaked paperwork, and empty cans of beans. Emily ran her fingers along a faded map pinned to the wall, tracing old patrol routes and marked danger zones. She wondered if her father's boots had once tracked the same floor, if he'd stood in the same beam of light as she did now. Grandpa Frank rummaged through the shelves, muttering to himself, "Your dad always kept a spare camera out here. Maybe he hid something important." Emily wandered to the back of the room, where a pile of broken equipment lay. She picked up the shattered pieces of a camera, the lens cracked, the case battered as if someone had stomped it in anger. She frowned, turning it over, finding a scrap of tape on the bottom with the faded letters. M5. Her pulse raced. "Grandpa, look, it's got the same code as Timber's plate." Frank joined her, his brow furrowed. "That's no coincidence." Suddenly, Timber, who had been quietly nosing through the doorway, let out a sharp, high whinny. Emily spun around just as the horse stomped and neighed, eyes wide and ears pinned back. Timber lunged toward the shadows in the corner, nostrils flaring, hooves scraping the dusty floor. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. She had never seen him so agitated. Frank stepped in front of her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Stay close, Em." From the darkness, something glinted, a jagged line of spray-painted graffiti on the wall. "Turn back, or she disappears." Emily's blood ran cold. She stared at the words, heart hammering in her chest. Frank muttered a curse under his breath, eyes darting around the room. Who the hell's been in here? On the floor beneath the graffiti, Emily found a cracked walkie-talkie. The antenna snapped, its casing muddy. She picked it up, wiping off the grime, her fingers shaking. "Do you think Dad tried to send a message?" she whispered. Frank's eyes narrowed. Maybe. Or maybe someone didn't want him to. Timber backed away from the wall, still snorting, his body tense and alert. Emily tried to soothe him, but he refused to settle. He looked toward the door, then back at the graffiti, as if he understood more than any of them. Frank knelt, inspecting the floor. Tracks. Someone's been here not long ago. And they weren't alone. He pointed to a muddy footprint, larger than Emily's, deep and fresh, overlaid with smaller prints. A streak of red paint matched the scrap Emily had found in the woods. Her stomach turned. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed outside. Timber jumped, nearly rearing up. Frank pulled Emily behind a metal cabinet, pressing a finger to his lips. They listened, breathless, as footsteps crunched in the snow just outside the warehouse. Emily's heart pounded so hard she was sure it could be heard. After a tense minute, the footsteps faded. When Frank peeked through the dirty window, the clearing was empty, except for wind-blown branches and Timber's hoof prints. "We need to go," he whispered, voice tight. They slipped out the back, Timber shadowing Emily like a bodyguard. As they trudged home through the thinning snow, Frank's face was grim. "This ties to your dad, Em. I don't know how, but it does." Emily hugged Timber's neck, feeling his heart racing as wildly as her own. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small. Frank looked back at the warehouse, then at the pines beyond. "We keep looking, and we watch our backs. Whoever's out there, they don't want us to find the truth." That night, the house felt smaller, the walls closer, as if the darkness pressed in from all sides. Sarah listened to their story in silence, her hands tight around her mug of tea. "We should go to the police again," she said, her voice trembling. Frank shook his head. "The sheriff can only do so much. Whoever's behind this, they know these woods better than anyone." Emily nodded, feeling older than her 8 years. She clutched her father's notebook, the pieces clicking into place: a horse with a ranger's code, a secret camera, graffiti threats, and a father who'd vanished in the pines. Timber stood by the window, staring out into the blackness as if he could see through the trees to the truth hidden beyond. She lay awake, the message echoing in her mind. Turn back, or she disappears. Was it meant for her? Or for someone else? Either way, she knew running wasn't an option. Not for her, not for Timber, not for her father's memory. With every clue, every warning, Emily's resolve grew. The pines might be dark and full of secrets, but she had Timber, and together they would face whatever shadows waited in the woods. A cold wind rattled the bare branches against Emily's window, waking her before dawn. She lay in bed, staring at the shifting shadows on the ceiling, the memory of that warning spray-painted in red at the warehouse carved into her mind. Turn back, or she disappears. It echoed in every silence, in every nervous glance her mom gave, in every creak of the house after dark. Grandpa Frank seemed changed too. He had always been steady, his voice gravelly and calm, but now he checked the locks on the doors twice each night and kept his old hunting rifle close. Timber, too, was never far from Emily, even sleeping just outside her window, as if he could stand guard against the woods themselves. That morning, while Sarah made coffee and Frank checked the road for fresh tire tracks, Emily wandered into the den, clutching her father's green notebook. She'd read it over and over, looking for anything she might have missed. On the inside cover, she finally noticed something she'd overlooked: a photo, folded and tucked between the pages. She opened it with trembling hands. It was old, faded, and creased from years of hiding. The image showed 3 people: her father, smiling in his ranger uniform; Timber, much younger, a proud gleam in his eyes; and a man Emily recognized from town, a tall, balding man with a forced, toothy grin. On the back of the photo, in her father's handwriting: "Me, M, 5, Clyde Mathers." Fall 2017, Clyde Mathers, the ex-mayor. Emily's heart pounded. She'd seen Clyde in town at parades and council meetings, his big white truck always parked out front. Grandpa Frank had once called him a smooth operator who could charm a trout out of a river. But why would her dad keep a photo with him? And why hide it in his private journal? When Frank came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, Emily handed him the photo. "Grandpa, do you know why Dad had this?" Frank's expression darkened. He sat heavily in his chair and took a long time before answering. "Your dad and Clyde Well, they used to work together, but they didn't see eye to eye, especially near the end. Emily waited, sensing this was a story that had never been told. Frank cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the wood stove. A few years back, before you were born, Clyde was accused of illegal logging on protected land. Your dad was the one who started looking into it. He and Timber, M5, patrolled the boundaries, took pictures, documented everything. Frank's jaw tightened. Clyde always denied it. He said your dad was out to ruin his reputation, that the evidence was fake. But your dad was stubborn. He wouldn't back down. Not even when threats started showing up on the porch. Emily's mind reeled. Did he ever tell the police? Frank nodded. The sheriff looked into it, but without hard proof, it was your dad's word against Clyde's. And Clyde, well, he had friends in high places. The investigation went nowhere. Your dad said he had more evidence, that he was close to exposing everything, but then Frank trailed off, his voice heavy with regret. Then he disappeared. Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, shook her head. I never wanted any of this, Frank. We moved here for peace, for Emily, not to dig up old ghosts. Frank looked at her, voice suddenly sharp. Those ghosts are why your husband vanished, Sarah. The room fell silent. Timber nickered from outside, as if sensing the tension. Sarah took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she clutched her mug. Maybe we should leave. Just for a while. I could take Emily to my sister's in Missoula. We'd be safe there. Emily's eyes widened. No. We can't just run away. What about Timber? What about Dad's clues? She turned to Frank for backup, panic tightening her chest, but Sarah was already packing bags in her mind, her face pale and determined. We'll call the sheriff. We'll explain everything and let them handle it. Suddenly, as Sarah walked toward the door, Timber stomped in front of the driveway, blocking her path. His body was a wall of muscle and warning, his eyes wild but steady. He pawed the snowy ground, refusing to budge even as Sarah tried to shoo him away. Let me pass! Timber! Sarah shouted, frustration breaking through her fear. But Timber didn't move. He lowered his head, meeting Emily's gaze as if to say, Not yet. Don't go. Frank watched the standoff, then smiled grimly. He knows something, Sarah. That horse was your husband's partner, and I'd wager he still remembers why. Sarah slumped onto the porch step, face buried in her hands. Emily crossed the yard and wrapped her arms around Timber's neck, whispering, Thank you. For a long while, no one spoke. The winter wind howled across the open fields, rattling the last brown needles from the pines. When Sarah finally looked up, her eyes were red but softer. All right. We'll stay. But if anything else happens, anything, we're gone. Agreed? Emily nodded, hope flickering in her chest. That night, after dinner, Emily couldn't sleep. She pored over the photo again, searching for new clues. She noticed something odd, her father's badge number in the corner, partially obscured by Timber's mane. She wrote it down in her notebook, just in case. She also remembered the USB and maps mentioned in her father's last journal entry. M5 knows the way. What if Timber could help her find them? She resolved to try, at first light. But the tension in the house didn't fade. Sarah checked the locks twice, and Frank slept with the rifle across his lap. Even Timber refused to go far from the porch, his head always turned toward the dark line of trees, ears pricked for trouble. For Emily, the story was no longer just about finding her father. It was about uncovering the truth the whole town seemed to want to forget. The truth Clyde Mathers had worked so hard to bury, and that Timber, her father's loyal partner, might hold in his memory, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. She pressed her forehead to the frosty window, watching Timber's silhouette in the moonlight. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would follow his lead. Wherever it took her. Morning broke in shades of pewter and blue. The frost was thick on the fields, the air biting through Emily's coat as she stepped outside. Timber was already waiting near the porch, steam curling from his nostrils, his dark eyes fixed on the woods. Emily glanced back at the house where her mother and Grandpa Frank were talking quietly, their faces drawn with worry and exhaustion. She tucked her father's notebook and the old photo into her backpack, tightened her boots, and patted Timber's neck. "Ready to help me, boy?" she whispered. Timber nickered softly, bobbing his head, and Emily felt a surge of courage. The clues had led her this far, and now, with her family hanging by a thread and the threat of Clyde Mathers shadowing their every move, she knew she had to do something. Her father's words echoed, "M5 knows the way." Trust him. She let Timber lead. They started across the icy yard, past the half-melted snowbanks, toward the northern edge of the property, the very spot marked with an X on her dad's rough map. The air was still, heavy with secrets. Timber's hooves crunched softly on the frozen earth, and Emily kept close, watching his ears swivel and his nose dip as he sniffed the wind. At the edge of the pines, Timber paused. His head jerked toward a stand of trees that Emily rarely explored, a thicket tangled with fallen branches and dead leaves, the sunlight barely reaching the ground. He moved with purpose, leading her off the usual path, deeper into the woods. Emily followed, her breath puffing in clouds, her heart beating faster. They stopped at an old stump, hollowed by rot and time, half hidden by brambles. Emily recognized it from years before, a landmark she and her dad had used when they played ranger games in the woods. Only now, the stump looked different. Its inside was blackened, as if scorched, and the ground around it was churned with hoof prints and boot marks. Timber nudged the stump, pawing at the earth. Emily dropped to her knees, hands numb as she brushed away the debris. Inside, wedged beneath a chunk of rotten wood, was a rusted tin can. Her fingers trembled as she pried it loose and shook out the contents. A USB drive caked in mud, a handful of forest maps marked with coded trails, and a torn scrap of paper. She wiped the drive on her sleeve, heart pounding. On the paper was her father's handwriting. "If you're reading this, it means you found Timber. Trust him. The truth is here. Don't let them bury it." The maps were covered in notes, red lines crisscrossing through the forest, circles around clearings and lakes, dates and initials that meant nothing to her, but must have meant everything to her dad. Timber stood beside her, quiet but alert, as if he, too, understood the importance of what they'd found. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind them. Emily whirled, clutching the tin to her chest. For a moment, all she saw was empty woods. But then, a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Her breath caught. She remembered the man in red, the threats, the fear. She had to get these clues home, to safety. Timber stepped forward, placing himself between Emily and the trees, muscles bunched and ready. Emily stuffed the maps and drive into her backpack, then gripped Timber's mane. "Let's go," she whispered. They hurried back toward the house, Emily glancing over her shoulder at every step. She saw nothing but heard the crackle of branches, the thump of boots. Someone was out there, watching, maybe following. When they burst into the yard, Grandpa Frank was on the porch, rifle in hand. "Emily." What happened? She skidded to a stop, gasping for air. "I found it. Dad's maps, a USB. There's something out there. Someone's following." Frank's face went hard. "Get inside, now." They rushed into the kitchen, Sarah's eyes wide with alarm. Emily dumped the contents of the tin on the table. "It's all here. Dad left it for us. Maps, codes. We have to look at what's on the drive." Frank wasted no time. He fetched his old laptop, the one he used for bills and weather reports, and plugged in the USB. The screen flickered, then loaded a series of video files. Emily's breath hitched as the first video began to play. A grainy recording of her father, Timber at his side, standing in the forest. Her dad's voice, low and urgent, filled the room. "If you're watching this, you know something's gone wrong. Clyde Mathers has been threatening me for weeks. He wants the forest for himself, wants to clear-cut the land, hide the evidence. I've documented every illegal log, every threat, every bribe. If anything happens to me, it's on him. Protect my family. Trust Timber. He knows the safe paths, and don't let Clyde get away with it." The next clip was shakier, a confrontation by the lakeshore. Clyde's face appeared red and twisted with rage. You keep your mouth shut, Harris, or you'll regret it. You and your family both. This land is mine now. If you go to the police, you'll disappear like the rest." Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes filling with tears. He really did it. All this time, I thought." Frank closed his hand over hers. "He did it, Sarah. And now we've got the proof." Emily watched Timber, who stood at the door, ears pricked, head high. He seemed to understand that the truth, long hidden, was finally coming to light. But even as relief surged through Emily, fear returned. If Clyde Mathers found out they had this evidence, what would he do? She remembered the warnings, the eyes in the dark, the feeling that they were never truly alone. That night, as Emily lay in bed clutching the maps, she heard Timber whinny softly outside her window. She slipped out to the porch, wrapped in her father's old flannel, and pressed her face against his warm neck. "We found it, boy," she whispered, "but we have to be careful. I think the worst is still to come." Timber nudged her gently, and in the hush of the Montana night, Emily felt her father's presence more strongly than ever. The secrets of the forest were no longer locked away, but the fight to keep them safe and to see justice done was just beginning. The Montana morning dawned bitter and gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. Emily didn't sleep. Instead, she lay in bed clutching the maps and the USB drive, replaying her father's desperate words and the footage of Clyde Mathers, his threats, his rage. Timber was restless, his hooves shifting in the frozen dirt, nostrils steaming each time he paced past Emily's window. Every hour, she watched the woods for a glimpse of movement, half expecting the man in red to step from the trees. By noon, a storm had rolled in, a wall of white swallowing the landscape, wind screaming through the pines. Sarah and Grandpa Frank spent the morning on edge, double-checking the doors, the windows, even the cellar. Frank kept his rifle loaded on the kitchen table, and Sarah kept Emily close, her fear raw and obvious. But Emily felt something more than fear, a sense of unfinished business, a mission her father had passed to her. She slipped Timber's old plate into her coat pocket, then the USB, then the maps. Just in case, she told herself, as Timber pressed his nose to her palm, warm and grounding. The blizzard worsened as evening fell. The wind howled, shaking the farmhouse, and the world beyond the porch was a whirl of white. It was then, at the edge of twilight, that Timber grew agitated, pacing, snorting, ears pinned. Emily hurried to the barn, lantern held high, and saw his wild eyes flicking toward the woods. Suddenly, a red shape darted through the snow, a shout splitting the frozen silence. "Emily!" It was Clyde Mathers, his red jacket vivid against the blizzard, eyes wild with panic and rage. He staggered through the drifts, one hand outstretched, the other gripping something metallic. Sarah screamed from the porch. Frank raised his rifle, voice booming over the storm. "Get back! You stay away from my granddaughter!" But Clyde only shouted, "You don't know what you're doing. Give me the evidence, and nobody gets hurt." Emily's blood ran cold. She backed away as Clyde advanced, his boots sinking into the drifts, his face twisted. Timber lunged in front of her, snorting and stamping, body rigid with tension. Clyde leveled his weapon, a crowbar, not a gun, and advanced, eyes fixed on Emily. "Give it here, kid. That drive, the maps, hand them over, or I'll—" A crash from the barn startled everyone. Timber rammed the old wooden gate, shattering it, then charged between Clyde and Emily. The big horse's presence was thunderous. He reared up, hooves flailing, forcing Clyde to stumble backward in the snow. Emily seized her chance. She slipped away from Clyde, Timber at her side, and bolted toward the far side of the property, toward the ranger hut hidden in the pines, her father's old shelter, a place she'd played as a child. She clutched the evidence to her chest as the wind roared. Behind her, she heard Clyde's boots pounding, his curses muffled by the blizzard. "Get back here," he roared, his shape a red blur in the whiteout. Emily ran, heart hammering, feet slipping on ice and snow. Timber kept pace beside her, guiding her with gentle nudges, never letting her fall. The world shrank to a tunnel of wind and snow, the only certainty the heat of Timber's flank and the terror burning in Emily's veins. They reached the hut, a battered wooden lean-to, barely visible in the white. Emily ducked inside, Timber following, and slammed the door. The hut shuddered as Timber pressed his body against it, a living barricade. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps. She fumbled for her flashlight and found her father's old radio on the shelf. She turned it on, static and hissing. She pressed the SOS button, just like her father had taught her. 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short. Outside, Clyde circled the hut, his shouts wild, barely audible over the wind. "You can't hide forever, Emily. Give it up." Emily shook, her fingers frozen, but she held tight to the USB and the maps. Timber whinnied, eyes rolling, but didn't move from the door. The minutes stretched, each one thick with terror and hope. Emily flashed her light through the hut's cracked window, SOS, over and over, hoping someone would see. The snow thickened, the wind relentless. She began to sob, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of running, the weight of so many secrets. Then, a faint reply, the sound of snowmobiles, voices calling her name. Grandpa Frank and Sheriff Riley, bundled against the cold, burst from the pines, led by Timber's tracks in the snow. Frank's voice was hoarse with worry. "Emily? Are you all right?" Emily flung open the door, falling into her grandpa's arms, the USB and maps clutched in her fist. Timber circled behind, snorting and stamping, eyes trained on the trees. Sheriff Riley pulled his gun, advancing on the shape of Clyde, who tried to run, slipping in the snow. Frank and the sheriff tackled him, pinning him to the ground. Clyde screamed, "You don't know what you're doing? That land is mine, that forest, mine." Frank looked down at him, voice shaking. "Not anymore, Mathers. Not after what you did to Harris, and not after tonight." Emily, shaking but safe, held up the evidence. "Dad left everything. Timber showed me. He saved us." Sheriff Riley cuffed Clyde, then turned to Emily, his voice softer. "You did good, kid. Real brave." Sarah arrived, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped Emily in her arms. "I thought I'd lost you." Emily looked at Timber, who stood guard, wind whipping his mane, head high and proud. "We're all safe," Emily said, voice trembling with relief and awe. The blizzard raged on, but inside the little hut and the warm glow of family and justice, Emily felt the tightness in her chest finally loosen. Timber nuzzled her cheek, warm and solid. She pressed her face to his neck, whispering, "Thank you, boy. Thank you." That night, as the authorities led Clyde Mathers away through the snow, Emily and her family huddled together in the farmhouse. Timber stood outside, his eyes trained on the woods, ears turned for danger, but at peace. For the first time since her father disappeared, Emily believed the truth would finally come to light, and the forest would be safe again. The girl and her horse, battered but unbroken, had faced the storm, and won. The storm that had shaken the valley for days finally began to subside, its wild winds surrendering to a cautious calm. In the early morning, heavy clouds thinned to mist, and pale winter sunlight glinted off the drifts piled high around the Harris house. Emily sat at the kitchen table, still wrapped in her father's old flannel, feeling the weight of exhaustion and relief mixing in her chest like cold and warm air meeting above the pines. The night before had played out in flashes. Sheriff Riley reading Clyde Mathers' rights, Grandpa Frank's fierce embrace, Sarah's tear-streaked face, Timber's comforting presence against the storm. For the first time in months, Emily slept deeply, knowing her father's enemy was finally in handcuffs. But daylight brought its own challenges, and there was still so much to be done. The sheriff returned early with a deputy and a small team, eager to process the evidence. Emily stood beside Frank and Sarah in the living room, clutching the maps, the USB drive, and the battered notebook. Timber, freshly brushed and bandaged, stood outside the window, head high, watching as if he understood the gravity of what was happening inside. Sheriff Riley plugged the USB drive into his laptop, connecting it to a portable generator set up on the kitchen counter. The screen flickered to life, displaying her father's grainy video, the confession of fear and hope, and then the confrontation by the lake shore. Clyde's face twisted with fury, his threats clear and unambiguous. Each time Clyde barked an order or made a promise of violence, the deputies exchanged glances, their suspicion turning to certainty. Frank explained what he and Emily had found: the warehouse, the graffiti, the broken camera, the red scrap of cloth. He handed over the evidence with trembling hands. Sarah described the nights of fear, the man in red lurking near the woods, the chilling message left in their path. Emily answered every question, her voice steady, her hands never leaving Timber's old patrol plate. The investigation snowballed. Deputies recovered more from the old Ranger warehouse, discarded bribe envelopes, notes written in Clyde's handwriting, and a series of half-burned ledgers listing illegal logging shipments, all carefully documented and tied to the ex-mayor's signature. The truth, hidden in shadows for years, began to take shape in the pale winter light. Clyde Mathers, defiant at first, was soon overwhelmed by the sheer weight of evidence. The sheriff's tone was iron as he read out the list of charges: illegal logging, evidence tampering, intimidation, and now the attempted kidnapping of a minor. Clyde's bravado collapsed. He hung his head, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, as he was led away in a patrol car. For a brief moment, Emily watched him from the porch, feeling not anger, but a strange, sad emptiness. It wasn't victory she felt, but closure, a painful story finally finished. As news spread through Kalispell, neighbors and townsfolk arrived at the Harris home. Some brought baked goods or hot drinks. Others simply came to see Timber, to thank him, to marvel at the bravery of the horse who'd saved a child and brought the truth to light. Timber, for his part, tolerated the attention with gentle patience, letting children pet his nose and old-timers pat his flank. He seemed content, though every so often his gaze drifted to the edge of the woods, as if he were listening for a voice only he could hear. Sheriff Riley gathered the family together that afternoon, the farmhouse buzzing with conversation and relief. "Sarah, Frank, Emily, I know this won't bring your husband back, but you should know you've done right by him. Your courage and Timber's made all the difference." Sarah's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Thank you, Sheriff, for believing us." The sheriff smiled at Emily. "That horse is something special, kiddo. Not many animals would do what he did. He's not just a pet, he's a guardian." Emily beamed, hugging Timber's neck as the horse nudged her gently. "He's part of our family," she said, her voice thick with emotion. For the next few days, Timber was a local celebrity. Reporters from the small-town paper came by to snap photos and jot down Emily's account. The vet stopped by, checking Timber's leg and marveling at his recovery. Timber even led the Harris family and a group of children through the woods on a safety ride, retracing the path he'd taken with Emily during the storm. There, beneath the tall pines, Emily felt her father's presence in every crunch of snow, every shaft of sunlight, every gentle nudge from Timber. Sarah watched them from the porch, her fear finally replaced with pride. She saw now what Timber truly meant to her family, not just a reminder of the past, but a protector in the present. Emily, for her part, cherished the feeling that Timber had never been lost, only waiting for the right moment to return. One evening, as dusk painted the sky lavender and blue, Sarah knelt beside Timber, running her fingers through his mane. "Thank you, old boy," she whispered. "You brought Emily back to us. You kept your promise." Timber lifted his head, nostrils quivering, as if accepting the gratitude. Emily smiled through tears, realizing for the first time that the story her father began was now hers to continue. She looked out at the trees, the snow melting in slow, bright patches, and felt hope, a real, strong hope, grow in her chest. That night, Emily sat with Timber beneath the stars, the woods calm and watchful. She told him stories of her father, of their old life, of dreams for the future. Timber listened, patient as ever, his eyes reflecting the firelight and the promise of safer days ahead. And as the first spring birds began to sing in the pines, Emily knew her journey with Timber was just beginning. Whatever darkness waited beyond the woods, she was no longer afraid. She had Timber, her family, and the truth on her side. They had faced the shadows, and together they had found their way back into the light. Spring came late to Kalispell that year, as if the world needed extra time to thaw from the storms that had upended so many lives. But when it did, it was a gentle miracle. Streams ran clear and cold, pine needles gleamed with new life, and the meadows blushed green beneath the warming sun. In the Harris family's barn, Timber nickered every morning for Emily, stamping the ground and tossing his head when he saw her appear with a halter and a smile. News of Timber's bravery had spread far and wide. Reporters came and went, their stories traveling beyond the county, painting Emily and her horse as heroes. But for Emily, the only thing that mattered was that her family was whole again. Her mother smiling in the kitchen, Grandpa Frank fixing fence posts while whistling old country tunes, and Timber waiting for her by the gate each sunrise, ready for the next adventure. As the weeks passed, Emily and Timber became a team known to every family in Kalispell. With the sheriff's encouragement, they started guiding groups of children on forest safety rides, retracing old ranger patrols and showing the next generation what it meant to care for the wild places around them. Sarah, who once saw Timber as a burden, now beamed with pride, watching her daughter lead a line of kids and ponies down sun-dappled trails. Every ride began with the same question. There, beneath the ancient pines, a new boy, shy and uncertain, would inevitably tug at Emily's sleeve, eyes wide with wonder. "Why does Timber always look at the trees?" he'd ask. Emily would smile, looking at the horse who had saved her life and brought her father's secrets into the light. She'd answer quietly, so only the children and the wind could hear. "He remembers who got lost in them?" she'd say, "and who came back." The children would ride in silent awe for a while after that, watching Timber's ears prick at the sound of a distant jay, his nose twitching at every change in the wind. Sometimes he'd pause, looking deep into the woods as if searching for someone only he could see. A memory, a friend, a promise yet unbroken. But life in Kalispell didn't simply return to normal. The town had changed. Clyde Mathers's arrest sent ripples through every dinner table, every council meeting, every forest trail. For years, people had whispered about lost rangers, about threats and secrets buried under snow and silence. Now, the truth was out, and Emily's father's name was spoken with respect and gratitude, his courage inspiring others to stand up for what was right. One bright Saturday, the sheriff organized a ceremony at the edge of the forest. Children and parents, neighbors, and old friends gathered in a clearing hung with ribbons and lanterns. Sheriff Riley called Timber forward, draping a garland of wildflowers around the gelding's neck and reading aloud from Emily's father's last ranger journal. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said, voice carrying over the crowd, "but the strength to do what's right, even when the world is watching or when you think you're all alone." Emily listened, tears stinging her eyes. When her turn came, she stood with Timber at her side and told her story. The hoofprint in the snow, the lonely days after her father's disappearance, the terror and hope that filled her heart the day Timber arrived, and the journey that had taught her to believe in herself again. She finished quietly, her voice trembling but clear. "If my dad taught me anything, it's that the woods keep their secrets until you learn to listen. And sometimes help comes in ways you never expect." Timber was never just a lost horse. He was my guide. He was waiting for me so I wouldn't have to find the truth alone. A hush fell over the clearing. Snowflakes, as light as whispers, began to fall, out of season, yet perfect in their timing. Timber turned his ears toward the trees, whinnying softly, his breath curling in the cool air. Emily hugged him, burying her face in his mane, feeling the past and future swirl around them like the drifting snow. As the crowd drifted home, Emily lingered beneath the pines, Timber at her side. She traced her fingers along his old patrol plate, now polished and gleaming, a symbol of all they'd overcome. She made a silent promise, to always protect the woods, to remember the lessons she'd learned, and to help anyone who might one day feel lost, just as she once did. Later that week, the family gathered around the kitchen table as Sarah edited a short video about Timber's journey. Grandpa Frank grumbled about the technology, but Emily laughed, sitting close to Timber so his face would be in every shot. Sarah added a gentle message at the end, a call to action for everyone who watched. If stories of courage and quiet strength move you, the voiceover said, like and subscribe. Share this to honor the unspoken bonds between children and their protectors. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust your heart and those who stand by your side, even in the darkest woods. The video spread quickly. Comments poured in from strangers, some who'd lost loved ones, some who'd found hope in the face of hardship, others who simply wanted to thank Emily and Timber for reminding them of the goodness still left in the world. Life moved on, but the bond between girl and horse only deepened. Each day, Emily discovered new trails and stories in the forest, new friends to guide, new secrets to uncover. Timber grew older, but never slower. He remained her steadfast protector, a reminder that love and loyalty outlast any storm. One evening, as dusk settled over the pines and the air turned cold, a little boy tugged at Emily's sleeve before a ride. "Does Timber ever get scared?" he asked. Emily smiled, looking at Timber, then at the woods alive with memories. "We all get scared sometimes," she said, "but that's how we know we're brave. When we keep going, no matter what." As the children mounted up and the last light faded from the sky, Timber whinnied softly, ears turned toward the pines. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the forest's ancient heart beating all around her. And in that moment, surrounded by those she loved, Emily knew the truth. When the pines remember, so do we. And as long as there are stories to tell and courage in the quietest places, no one is ever truly lost. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs hope. Because sometimes, the strongest guides come on four hooves, and the bravest hearts are found in the unlikeliest places.